Bengali Muslims were killed in less than 6 hours in the state of Assam, in a place called Nellie, which is around 60 kilometers from Guwahati. Not one person was punished. Today, we are going to talk about Assam's forgotten genocide. We have with us two brilliant speakers who had their seminal work on Nelly. Subhashri Krishnan is a filmmaker whose works deals with citizenship through the lens of memory, migration, and interrogations of official identity documents. Her films include Brave New Medium on internet and censorship in the Southeast Asia, What Fields Remember, which is on Nelly Massacre in Assam in 1983, Sikirni Maswanai, which is a dance of the butterfly about disappearing live performance music form in the Chirang district of Assam. Subhashri is a recipient of the Filmmaker Artist Residency at the Goethe Institute, Salvador Bahia, Brazil in 2017. She was also awarded Chevening Fellowship in 2015, Charles Wells Research Grant in 2012, and George Washington University Filmmaker Fellowship Award in 2008. Welcome, Subhashri. It's a pleasure having you. Our next speaker is Professor Makiko Kimura. She teaches at Tsuda University, Tokyo, Japan. Professor Makiko Kimura studied at the Jawaharlal Nehru University for her PhD degree. She was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Japan Society for Promotion of Science and Research Associate at the International Peace Research Institute, Meiki Gakuin University, Tokyo. Like I said, she is a professor at the Tsuda University, Tokyo, and teaches transnational sociology. She engages herself in activism supporting indigenous minority rights movement. She is the author of the seminal book on Nelly called The Nelly Massacre of 1983, which is published by Sage. She lives in Japan. So I will start with Professor Kimura. The first questions right away to you. I want to know that, even people in Assam have stopped talking about the Nelly Massacre. It has become a sort of taboo. So what made you to start a research on Nelly and write a book on it? And why is this discussion on Nelly important?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you, Amal, for introducing, and thanks for your questions. Well, it's been already more than 20 years since I went to Nelly. It was in 2001. And that was the time when I was conducting my PhD research in JNU. Well, my PhD topic was on this something called movement, Assam Andolan, this movement from 79 to 85. And well, I was, interviewing many student leaders, academics, middle class leaders. But I thought like I should go to rural areas and, tribal and peasant participation. So then a friend of mine in Guwahati, in Assam, that there was a big killing where, a large number of tribal people have also participated. So he suggested me to go to the place, and then I came to know about Nelly. And so that was the first time I came to know about Nelly. And well, in the beginning, I was not really aware how big the incident was. So after visiting, I came to know that it was one of the largest killing in independent India. And that's why I started, doing some research on this. My book is solely on Nelly, but that, part, I have developed, after submitting my PhD dissertation. The next question you have posed, why is discussion on Nelly is important? I think there are a few, reasons to focus on Nelly. One is that this is, as I said, this is one of the largest, collective violence which took place in independent India, apart from partition violence. No, there are only a few equivalent cases like Gujarat riot in 2002 or Nelly has been not Nelly hasn't been discussed so much. That's one thing. And also, Nelly is also very unique in the sense that, in other two cases, it was very clear that the government was on the side of the rioters, those who were attacking them. In Nelly, it was different because that time it was the Congress government which was at the center, and they were desperately trying to impose, state legislative assembly election in Assam to elect, Congress government in the state. It's a movement, leaders who were desperately trying to stop the election because they thought, in the voters' roll, there are lots of, names of the foreigners. And they said, we have to drive out these foreigners. So, the government was definitely trying to, protect Muslims, different origins, were the victims. But they failed, and this is a very unique case because, police and security forces were trying to protect them, but they failed. It's a very intense, violent, case atmosphere was there.
Thank you so much, Professor Makiko Kimura. I will continue that questions with Subhashri. After 32 years after the genocide, you made a documentary, What Fields Remember, on Nelly. Can I ask you what made you to make a documentary on Nelly?
Thank you, Aman, and to the organizers of India on the Brink. Thank you for not just inviting me on this panel, but also having a session on Nelly. I'm really glad this is happening. And it's also wonderful to be sharing this space with Makiko, whose work, of course, I've read, but it's the first time we've ever been asked to be on a panel together. So for that reason as well. But Aman, to answer your question, it's going to be slightly long-winded. In 2006, on the 25th anniversary of the Nelly Massacre, this journalist called Teresa Rahman had written a piece on the Nelly Massacre for Tehelka. And she was in fact this was in 2000, she was in fact speaking about how those who are the survivors of the massacre, how they were coping with it, after these many years of the massacre and not having really received any compensation or any form of justice. And of course, this kind of piqued my interest because in 1983, when the Nelly Massacre happened, I was very young, but I was living in Assam then. I was an 8-year-old. I was living in a place called Tinsukia. So I called my mother and I was like, do you remember there's this vague memory I had as a child of something happening? And this was, of course, in a different part of Assam, which is in Upper Assam. And my mother, of course, recounted her memories of what she remembered. And then I started to look for, this was in 2006, or look for things around the Nelly Massacre, writings, films. And really, I found almost nothing. There were some pieces on Assam in academic journals or books that historians and sociologists who work on Assam. But Nelly was, as I always say, was like a footnote. It may appear in some things, but it was a void. It was a blank. It's almost as if this had never happened. And of course, after that, I started thinking about this question, which, we're all, I think, engaged in at this moment. Like, why is it that we choose to forget some things? Amnesia, and we know not just in the Indian context, in other contexts as well, it is structural. It's never so innocent. So I started asking this question about collective memory and collective amnesia. And of course, I started working on my film in 2013. I managed to somehow get a grant to work on a film. And that's when Makiko's book, in fact, came out. So thank you, Makiko. In some ways, that was the starting point. And of course, I got in touch with her and she put me in touch with folks. So I think for me, fundamentally, it was this question that led me to work on Nelly. And then, of course, I've continued to work in Assam and continue to even today, is this question of why is it that we choose to forget some things? Not the people who've been through it, because they live with it forever, but those of us who are outside. And we can discuss this in this session. There is a complex set of reasons as to why that happens, and it is structural. Why something is actually in the margins and continues to remain. Even for those of us who believe in secular democratic politics, we speak about Gujarat. Even today, we speak about Bhagalpur. But Nelly is always, yeah, that happened, but that's something on the side. But yeah, my reason for actually wanting to make the film was to actually ask this question, why do we forget? But through the making of the film, I realized who was asking the question. Yes, as Subhashri Krishnan, I look at it as collective amnesia, but for the survivors who've been through it, it's very much part of their lives in some way or the other.
Thank you so much, Subhashri. I will now go to Professor Kimura. After the violence, 1 month after the violence, the government of India set up this Tiwali Commission, and who investigated for 1 year, and they came up with a report in April 1984. The report was about what led to the violence and what happened during that violence. Commission is often used just to, as an excuse to overlook things. I want to know, can you please tell our audience that what exactly was the Tiwali Commission report? What were the most important findings? And most importantly, that report was never tabled, that report was never made public. And why was it never made public? Can you please throw some light on it?
Okay, thanks. Yes, Tiwali Commission report. It's a long report actually. It's more than I think 500 pages, and it's not only on Nelly, but it was on the violence, which took place during the legislative assembly elections. So it's a huge report, and it covers a lot of subjects. It's not only on all those group clashes, but say bombing, and maybe not police atrocities, but yes, they have counted all those things. So on Nelly, it's only like maybe several pages, but there are still some important findings in it. I say that police and security forces were trying to stop the violence, but on the ground, especially those low-ranking officers from Assam, police officers from Assam, they were not really willing to prevent the violence. So there was some negligence of duties. So he has been punished. So those things are stated there. Another important, findings from this report is that, group crashes was very, very, there were a huge number of group crashes in Assam at that time. Nelly was of course the largest, and other incidents are more smaller, but I would say like maybe more than 200 group crashes took place in Nogam, Doram, and so, the kind of situation that people were, placed. And all those, like SPs and DIG interviews said, if there's only one criminal, we can go and catch them. But if everybody is running and then trying to attack somebody else, it's very difficult to control the situation. So that's what the police officers say. Thing is that so why this hasn't been made public? But it was Congress government which decided to hide this report. So we should question. But I can my guess is that there was a fierce criticism against Congress as well because they tried to force the election, the violence happened, and many people have predicted this, so they wanted to they didn't want those criticisms to continue. Yeah, that's my guess.
Thank you so much, Professor Makiko. Subhashri, this perpetual impunity, this inaction, of course, no one was ever punished. Even the report was not made public. Your documentary focused on the human side of Nelly, the suffering, the psychological impact it had left, and also not only the violence, but also this injustice. The people you interviewed, they repeatedly talks about the injustice more than the violence actually. Uh, can you please explain the human side of Nelly, and what exactly does this perpetual injustice does to people?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, I also want to kind of tell our audience, for those who are not familiar, that we call it the Nelly Massacre. But the attack happened, for any of you who've traveled to the region, it wasn't just the town of Nelly. It's Nelly and 13 other villages and hamlets around, within a radius of 20 kilometers. So it was places like Nelly. It was a village called Borburi, which is 22 kilometers from Nelly. It was Bagduga Habi, which is 7 kilometers away. The simple point that I'm trying to make, that there's a way that we explain the massacre. Whenever I've spoken to people on all sides, that's like, the elections, Indira Gandhi had announced the election, and there was anyway a lot of outrage and anger, and for good reason, perhaps. There is a very central way of looking at the northeastern Assam, and people were pissed. But the point I'm trying to make is, when you attack 14 places in a span of 6 hours, it was planned. There is nothing spontaneous about it. There is nothing spontaneous about any form of violence that happens at this scale. It was planned. It was not stopped for 6 hours. The killings were allowed to take place. I mean, I'm just putting it to the audience to say that we call it the Nelly Massacre, and there's a way that also spelling out the geography is very important, that simultaneously, in a radius of 22 kilometers, these attacks were happening on the morning of February 18th. So, I mean, that's just something I thought I should add. But to come to this thing of why was I solely, I mean, you didn't ask me like that, but that's a question from what I understand, to focus on the survivors and their memory of the day, and not so much on the violence, but this idea of how they live with. I mean, there are 2-3 reasons for that. One is, when I was doing my work on Assam and all the written material that's there. Of course, it was a very complex time. The Assam anti-foreigner agitation had already begun in 1979. There was violence, ethnic violence between different communities in different places. This was already happening, and some of it is actually well documented, right? But nowhere, apart from a bite kind of thing in a journalistic piece, and of course Makiko did speak to the survivors. She spoke to the survivors and the alleged perpetrators, but in film, I hadn't really seen anything where anybody had really engaged with what is it that not just the survivors went through, but how have they learned to live with it. And the reason I chose actually to not focus too much, I mean, except for this one person who describes what happened to his children on the day. If you notice in the film, I've actually not focused on the violence. I've not used any of the images. If you Google Nelly in the public domain, you use, because I do think there's a pornography of violence, right? I'm not a journalist. If I were a journalist, and if I was around during the time and taking those photos and filming, it made sense. But I'm also going 32 years later. And 32 years later, even if you've been through the most horrific violence, there is a way that you have, quote unquote, moved on. There's a way that you remember it. So my film was actually about the memory of, in some ways, what happened and how they cope with it. And I felt that it was important to respect how the people in the film thought about it. So for example, the 2 people in the film, one is Sirajuddin Ahmad, who unfortunately actually passed away on February 17th, one of the protagonists in the film. He actually, except for this one time, never spoke to me about the massacre. He wasn't interested. He wanted to speak about religion. He wanted to speak about violence. He wanted to speak about politics, but he didn't want to actually speak about what is it that happened to him, to his family. And as a filmmaker, going 32 years later, I had to respect that. Whereas Abdul Khairji was far more open. And I think what I was trying to do, because at the end of the day, what is a film? A film is a form of representation. What I was kind of represent through the voice of these 2 men and the landscape as well, which, so every place you see in the film, for those who've seen the film, is a site of violence. I was trying to recreate in some ways for the audience, what is it that may have happened? Because, I mean, I wasn't there, I don't have footage for it, but what is it that people may have been through, and what this violence had meant. And that's why I focused on the personal stories. And another important part of it is also, I do actually deeply believe the personal is political. There's a way, I think, in our politics that we speak of structures in a certain way, but what the interiority of human beings, the personal is just never about this happened to Aman or this happened to Subhashri, but it happens in a certain context and it portends to something larger that was happening. And that's part of the reason also I chose to actually focus on these two men, but the film's also actually talking about larger political things. I'd like to think. I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah.
Just a follow-up question. See, I always had this grievance that, the civil society has failed to do anything. Of course, the government failed, but the civil society has also failed. One thing very striking that one of the survivors says that he took solace in religion. He took into religion to sort of maybe forget the violence, and to have some kind of peace. So can you tell us that did their suffering increased because of inaction from the civil society, and how the civil society has failed to do anything to give them any kind of relief, either to challenge that order which dropped all the charge sheet, or to give them some kind of compensation? So what was the role of the civil society, and how their inaction has also increased the suffering of the survivors?
That's a very interesting question. And this is a question I keep getting asked, right? This man who actually has no faith in any way of the legal courts and systems is now saying redemption is in the afterlife. It doesn't exist here. And he, in a way, ends the film. So, I mean, there's a lot of critique also I received for the film. I mean, there's two reasons, right? As I was going there, and I was actually interested in, when I started, in looking at the register of course, the legality, which in some ways Abdul Khairji represents. But I realized during the filming and during the edit that in the case of the Nelly survivors, whether that's religion in Sirajuddin Ji's case, or the court system in which Abdul Khairji believes, they're both a matter of faith, because it's not as if you believe in the court system. In the case of the Nelly survivors, they actually were able to get justice. Not a single person was ever put behind bars. So in some ways, to say I will actually fight these to the court is as much as a matter of faith like religion. To be very honest, I don't see the difference. With Sirajuddin Ji, actually, before the Nelly massacre happened, he wasn't an atheist, but he actually was not somebody who had much struck with religion. He was that person, is what he remembers and what his family says. But basically, after the massacre took place, it affected him very, very deeply. And I must also say here that I found that his relationship with religion was a very peculiar personal one. So he was very critical with all forms of organized religion, whether that's Christianity, Islam, Hinduism. So he would never go to the mosque and pray. His prayer was always at home. The Nelly, the remembrance that happens every year, he wouldn't go there because he felt like the grief was very private. So he also had a particular take on religion. And I think for Sirajuddin Ji, it became a thing of, I mean, I don't want to kind of speak on his behalf, because I feel like these are things only for the person who has been through it. It is for him or her to speak. I'm merely perhaps a very poor interlocutor, but I think for him it was this thing of everything that you know around you has failed you. Civil society has failed you, the courts have failed you, everything has failed you. So perhaps Allah is the only person, and not in this lifetime, in once you die, there may be some redemption. And this is something that a lot of people in various screening have been uncomfortable with, and asked me that the film also ends with the prayer. It's as if to say there is no hope. And my response to always to that is, this is how I saw it. And I'm not going to create a sense of false hope if I didn't see it. That's not how I experienced it. And that's not what it is for the people who are the survivors, at least then.
Thank you so much. That's quite a reflection of the society, actually. And like you said, it ended with prayer. And I believe that because there was no justice, there was no hope, and prayer is the only thing that would have given them peace. I will now ask Professor Makiko Kimura about the reason behind the violence. So it is often said that there was an election scheduled on 14th of on February, and people from Nelly voted, and that become sort of impetus to kill these people. But violence was all through, from January, February, on 14th when the election was held. around 1,000 people were killed in Saulkhwa. Again, of course, no one was ever punished. And that is the same place where eviction is taking place today. There was violence in Mukalmua, there was violence in all over Assam, basically. And so I want to ask you that, what was the reason behind this violence?
Very difficult to answer this question. What was the reason for this riot? Because if it's army operation, there's one person who, directly orders. But if it's a collective violence, there are many people who have been involved. So there are many stories on this. I can just, point out some of the facts which led to this violence. Before the violence, there were lots of rumors. And also, not only rumors, like, cases where, Tiwals have been attacked, these people, court people have been attacked. Also, there are some cases where, Muslims have been attacked and then they took shelter in Nelly. All these, rumors and some of the real stories. So it's both sides, Tiwals and local Assamese. They were also, very, very frightened, and they thought, if we don't attack, them, then that's one thing. Another thing, but election and voting, these are, of course, this is the set of the balance, that the race was desperately trying to stop them from voting, and Muslims were definitely wanted to vote. Voting. Congress was instigating them. So there was a really a tension between them. So I would say election was, of course, one of the factors. As I said, as many scholars, pointed out, there was, issues of land alienation among the tribe. Sentiments especially from the Tiwas. Once this land was ours, but it's been taken away from us. There is a more complicated stories behind this, but it is true that they have this sentiment. It's pretty complicated, So, but if point out some of the direct cause which triggers the violence, election and voting, and of course those small scales of attacks and killing just took place just before the Nelly.
Just a follow-up question to you. So you must have also researched about the reporting because you spoke about rumors. So what was the reporting likes in the Assamese newspaper before their violence, and was it also responsible for this violence?
Well, papers, there were some of the reportings like this, there were like doctors arriving on shores, and some Rajakars were, arriving like from Pakistan side. All these, rumors from Bangladesh side, all these rumors were there, of course. But during, I think, as a movement, during this, 83, it's, spread from mouth to mouth, basically.
Okay.
Just before the.
Okay, thank you so much. Subhashri, this is a follow-up question. She spoke about rumors and the insecurity of the community which came and massacred, committed genocide on this. I'm sure this was not that simple. And she also mentioned about Rajakars. I remember reading a journalist talking about, like, 3 days before the massacre, Assamese newspaper was all about that, Rajakars from Bangladesh was coming and attack Assam. And this was after 12 years after Rajakars were almost decimated in Bangladesh. I mean, this was after 13 years after Bangladesh came into existence. And by then, Rajakar had no influence. So this fake news, that similar fake news is happening today. We are discussing about a genocide because about the recent genocide speech, about this continuous fake news, these insecurities, this hate mongering about Muslims. So can you please explain us that what does Nelly Massacre gives a message or explains about what is happening today? Do you feel there are similarities of what happened before that, the violence, and what is happening today?
I mean, oh, definitely. I see traces, and that's, I mean, as I've said, I mean, it's not just the Nelly massacre. I do feel what is happening in Assam today, and by that I mean, not just the NLC exercise, of course, since 2015 that began, the D voters, people who've been pronounced as D voters, those in detention centers who've been there since the mid 90s. And please note that even in the 60s, actually, there were detention centers in Assam and people were being put in the detention centers. And then again, it restarts in the mid 90s. I see all of this as traces of what I call the post-partition story to some extent, and also post-71. So in some ways, and especially if you live out of Assam and you live in Delhi, you feel like, oh my God, since 2015 is when all of this is happening in Assam. It's not true. I think in Assam, the violence is cyclical against different communities. And here I'm speaking about the figure of the Bengali person, the poor Bengali quote unquote migrant. It doesn't matter if you came in the 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s, you are forever seen as the other, as the outsider. And I do feel like this is to do with both Bengali Muslims and, of course, Bengali Hindus as well. You will see that there are many people who are from the Bengali Hindu community as well who've been put in detention centers. So this is also an anti-poor Bengali kind of thing. And I feel that in today's climate, a certain of course, I'm going to be attacked for saying this, a certain, let's say, ethnic kind of difference, so I was going to say ethno-nationalism, but I stopped myself, has come in very neatly fit together with the kind of Hindutva politics that you see today, right? What was a certain kind of ethnic and linguistic kind of struggle on the one end and violence on the other has now very neatly formed and co-joined with the Hindutva politics. And the question I wonder, because I continue to work in Assam, is it is being said, and it is true, that, the voice of the indigenous community, that the land has been taken away, that the indigenous community, and whether it's not just the Tivas, but people from indigenous communities from other parts of Assam, right? The land has been taken away and that the migrant has come and taken over the land. Now, I'm not in a position to comment. There is some historical truth to it. We do know that colonialism did bring migration, but I think there's a way that we constantly seek refuge only in history and refuse to address actually the present. Like, how long are you going to look at the figure of the Bengali person or the Bengali Muslim and say, you are Bangladeshi? And you see that sentiment, you please go to Assam, you do research. You see that sentiment even today, and it doesn't matter. So in some ways, it doesn't matter the number of people who have papers, who have your Aadhaar card, you have your PAN card, you are in an election ID, and you're still sent to a detention center, right? So what do you have to do to say, actually, I am from here? I'm not sure what the answer is to this question, but all I'm saying is the trace of Nelly, the trace of what has happened, because I also think post-partition Assam, unlike Bengal or Punjab, had not too much work. Rigorous historical work has been done on it. This is my reading of it. And it is actually in some ways the traces of partition that you see even today. I'm not sure what the answer to this or what the solution to this is, but I'm saying unless we find, it is also a political question. And unless there is some kind of answer you find to this, you will find today it's NRC, tomorrow it will be something else. Because even if you find your name on the NRC, it's not going to stop you from being looked at the other. So it comes from a place of fear as well. And how do you address fear? I don't know the answer to that.
Particularly when the fear is so unfounded.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So, Professor Kimura, last question to you. Again, I am coming back to impunity. Around 7,000 FIR, 299 charge sheets, all dropped by one order. We understand that AGP came to power by then. Can you please explain why the victims, the survivors of Nelly, never got justice?
Um, um, well, it's first of all, the system has failed because I still don't understand, how come the judiciary, this process that, because in Japan, once they file the charge sheet, then it will never get dropped, by the government's intervention. Because the system has failed, I think there's something extremely wrong with the system. And second thing was that, I think the Muslims of migrant origin in Assam has long been deprived of their voices. And it's been big that they started, represent themselves, like I'm sure you know about Mia poetry and all. I think there were hardly any organization which represented them. And especially, Nelly is in their locality. Uh, there are very few, educated, people. I think that's another reason why, they could not, push strongly towards this, because I know many human rights, activists and lawyers, they said they want to lend hands to their cases to push forward. But I think there was, so, the link with those, activists and the local people haven't been established so far. So all these things happening, I think. And I think especially the silence in the civil society of Assam, really had been, contributing there too.
Thank you so much. That also speaks volumes about the inaction of the civil society and its failure. Coming to Subhashri, you are an outsider, right? How, what do you make of this charge that outsiders, both of you are outsiders and both of you have seminar work on Nelly? So what do you make of this charge that outsiders really don't understand Assam, and the outsiders should not speak on Assam and do not understand this complexity? So how do you make this charge? I mean,
how do I make sense of it? I mean, to be honest, Aman, it's been a journey. In 2013, I mean, it wasn't the first time I was going to Assam. I have connections with Assam, but when I started the work in 2013, and when what Fields Remember completed in 2016 was screened in Guwahati, Studio Nilima, the only place that's actually screened the film. There was that charge of, oh yeah, you've made a film. And it's usually Assamese men. You've made a film, but let us tell you what you didn't get A, B, C, D, right? And my attitude, not just to Assam, to anything, I think anybody should be able to go anywhere, make a film, write a book, write an article. I think it's really oppressive to say that you can only work from a place or if you belong there. I think for us outsiders, what is incumbent upon us is that you get to know a place on its terms. And that's a mistake I think many people do with Assam, right? You want to say, look at Nelly and you want to say, oh, Gujarat. Actually, Nelly wasn't Gujarat. I mean, the different conditions that produced it and what is happening in Assam today is something else. So I think you need to be able to, and I've written about this and said very often, you need to be able to engage with a place on its own terms, have rigor in how you engage with it. But the whole outsider charge, which I hear even today, I don't have much stuck with it. I just feel that people should, and thank God, there are many more people. When I was making the film on Nelly, and I'm sure Makiko, I'm sure can speak to this as well, there weren't many people working on Assam or I mean, the detention centers were already there way back in 2013 or 2015. Nobody was writing about it, talking about it, forget about Nelly. But today, many more people are, and I'm so glad for that. And of course, in that, you will see factually incorrect things because, that's just the nature of news and how things come out. But I think people should, outsider, insider, quasi outsider, insider, everybody should work in various places. That's my own position. And as I've often said, I do feel like in Assam, the complex history, and it is a complex history. ethnically and linguistically. I will also say this. It is complex. It is not like, say, a Gujarat or Uttar Pradesh in that sense, right? Even today. But to keep saying, oh, our history is complex, is a smoke screen. It's I feel like, yes, we have to think through the complexity. And where places where mass violence has happened, as it did in the case of Nelly, why is it that actually the survivor in terms of civil compensation got 5,000 rupees or maybe 3,000 rupees and some 10 sheets till date? I mean, and I do believe financial compensation is also a form of justice. There's nothing else many survivors have got. There's not a single alleged perpetrator who has actually gone to the jail. There were some 700 odd FIRs and 299 charge sheets that were eventually filed and dropped. And this is a question we must keep asking, despite Assam being a really complex place. And we should be able to hold both. That's my position.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for finding time and throwing light into this forgotten genocide. Talking about detention center, when I start working, that's what struck me, that no one knows about it. And the Moin al-Mullah's case, who was in detention center for more than 2 years by then when we took up the case, that was one case which was reported for the first time. As we, 39 years later, as we talk about other genocidal speech, in Assam also, there were 2 genocidal speeches recently, where, before dozens of cameras, organizations, Bajrang Dal, BHP, they openly gave a call for genocide. This is what precedes genocides, this call for genocides, this genocide mongering. And today, the purpose of talking about Nelly is also to prevent a probable genocide that everyone is predicting, including Mr. Gregory Stanton, who correctly predicted Rwanda genocide. So all we can hope is that the authorities will take action on peoples who are on genocide mongers, who are calling for genocide, the hate mongers. We as responsible citizens should be aware about the fake news that is floating around. And maybe that's how, with all our collective effort, we can stop a probable genocide. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Professor Makiko, Kimura, and Subhashrikan and Krishnan, again, for giving us time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks. Bye.